After the slow death of Star Trek Enterprise in 2005, Star Trek returned to the big screen with a bang in 2009. A fresh reboot set in an alternate timeline with a new cast playing the iconic characters of the original series. While some hardcore detractors voiced their disapproval online, for many Star Trek was a crossover hit. It was critically acclaimed and the highest grossing Star Trek movie at the time. Having become such a success, a sequel was inevitable. The question of whether the hot streak from 2009 could be maintained would be answered in 2013. In 2009, Star Trek made a triumphant return to the big screen, but Paramount Pictures was very pleased with Star Trek even before its release, and had already asked the creative team of J.J. Abrams, Brian Burke, Damon Lindelof, Roberto Orci, and Alex Kurtzman to produce a sequel. However, it took quite some time for the vision for this sequel to fully come together. Orci and Kurtzman returned to pen the script, this time joined by Lindelof. Building on the success of the previous film, the trio believed they needed a central villain for their story. While Nero had essentially become a fierce antagonist for Spock in Star Trek, this time the trio wanted an antagonist for Kirk, and naturally the conversation led to the character Khan Noonien Singh. Though using the character was discussed, the writers took a long time to commit to the idea, and struggled to find a suitable story to feature the character. The slow start to the film was further exacerbated by the team's own busy schedules. Kurtzman and Orci, between Star Trek movies, were also working on a Transformers sequel, the graphic novel adaptation Cowboys and Aliens, as well as continuing to produce the television show Fringe. Lindelof, after Star Trek, was busy winding down Lost, as well as working on Ridley Scott's Prometheus. Abrams, meanwhile, on top of his television work, had begun work on his next feature film, Super 8. This scheduling difficulty pushed back the sequel's release from an initial summer 2011 release to an eventual summer 2013 release. At first, the team discussed the fallout of Vulcan's destruction and how much that would be involved in the sequel, but Abrams and Lindelof were insistent that a sequel had to stand on its own. While the sequel would have its own plot separate from the previous film, however, the character arcs would need to continue. While Star Trek was about the crew coming together, the sequel would be about the crew growing and maturing, therefore they needed to be tested to the extreme. The sequel needed to go to a darker place and have a more powerful antagonist. This led the conversation back to Khan Noonien Singh. Roberto Orci said, "In a way, Damon and I were the biggest debaters about this. He argued for Khan from the beginning, and I argued against it." Lindelof said of Khan, "He had such an intense gravity in the Star Trek universe, we likely would have expended more energy to not put him in this movie than the other way around." Abrams recalled, "The fun of this timeline is arguing that different stories with the same characters could be equally if not more compelling than what's been told before. Certain people are destined to cross paths and come together, and Khan is out there, even if he doesn't have the same issues." Eventually, Orci and Lindelof were able to reconcile their differing opinions on Khan by recontextualizing his character as part of a larger plot, different to his original motivations. Orci said, "The antagonist's motives were based on his use by a corrupted system of power that held things he held dear against him and tried to manipulate him. That story stands alone with or without Star Trek history." Having seemingly cracked the idea for the sequel, casting the right actor for Khan was crucial. Though as part of the marketing efforts, Abrams' trademark mystery box secrecy made sure Khan's involvement in the story would be kept secret from audiences until the movie was released. Instead, Khan's in-universe cover of John Harrison was publicly stated to be the villain's identity. Actors considered for Harrison/Khan included Benicio del Toro, Edgar Ramirez, and Demian Bichir. But in the end, English actor Benedict Cumberbatch won the role. Cumberbatch had steady work on British television all throughout the 2000s, and had won critical acclaim on London's West End. But it was his role as Sherlock Holmes in the BBC's modern reimagining of the detective which made him a household name. Coupled with his roles in 12 Years a Slave and the Hobbit series, and Cumberbatch quickly became one of the most in-demand actors for Hollywood blockbusters and award-season dramas of the day. To explain Khan's noticeable change in ethnic appearance, the tie-in graphic novel Countdown shows Khan undergoing cosmetic surgery to better hide his identity. Also joining the returning cast members from the previous film were Alice Eve as Carol Marcus and Peter Weller as her father, Admiral Marcus. Having returned to retirement, the iconic Leonard Nimoy declined an offer to reprise the role of Spock for this sequel, but after an unsuccessful attempt by Abrams to secure involvement from William Shatner, Nimoy was convinced to return for a small cameo. By April, the first draft of the script had finally been completed, titled Star Trek Into Darkness, and after reading the script, Abrams chose to return to the director's chair following completion of Super 8. Virtually all of Abrams' collaborators from the previous film returned, including ILM visual effects supervisor Roger Guyot, director of photography Dan Mindel, and production designer Scott Chambliss. For Chambliss and the art department team, one of the most important tasks was redesigning the Klingons. The Klingons had originally appeared in a deleted sequence for the previous film, shown in intimidating costumes designed by Michael Kaplan, but the actual Klingons underneath the masks were never seen. For Star Trek Into Darkness, the creative team were determined to bring the Klingons back, as they had been absent for the previous movie. Chambliss worked closely with designers Neville Page and Dave Anderson to create the new look for the Klingons, their ships, weapons, and their homeworld Konos. Chambliss envisioned Konos as a bombed-out toxic wasteland. Due to the Klingons being so warlike and having fought each other, at some point they would have used chemical and nuclear weapons in their various conflicts. For the Klingons themselves, the designers kept the overall look, but added the idea of the distinctive forehead ridges snaking back over the head. They also added the cultural component of the piercings in the nose and ridges, suggesting the more badass the Klingon, the more piercings.
Now I am officially blinged out.
For the Klingon dialogue, linguist Mark Okrand once again lent his services to the production, inventing some new Klingon words and adjusting some of the pronunciations.
I guess no one can complain if this doesn't sound right to them.
Oh, they can complain. They'll definitely be able to complain, and I'll have to explain to them why it's right anyway.
Zoe Saldana, having previously learned Na'vi for James Cameron's Avatar, took to Klingon very easily.
Mech.
Yach mech mech.
Mech.
Rach v'shamech. Edge dodge me which betlak kamech. Not there because poop.
Right.
Filming began on the 12th of January 2012, just as before the production shot at Paramount Studios and Backlot, as well as locations throughout California, and additional photography in Iceland. Also just as before, Abrams and Mindel opted to shoot Into Darkness on film rather than digital, this time mixing in IMAX footage as well as 65mm film for certain scenes. While not shot in 3D, the movie would be post-converted into 3D as was the trend at the time following Avatar. While previously the production used a Budweiser beer plant for the Enterprise's engineering, this time the production opted to instead use Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, with its experimental fusion reactor standing in for the Enterprise's main reactor. Other locations in the film, such as the Nibiru planet, Volcano, and Konos, were all either shot at the Paramount soundstages or Paramount Backlot. During filming, a guest of the set, Edgar Wright, director of the acclaimed Cornetto trilogy, directed a single shot in the film. While he has never revealed which one, it was likely during the sequence on Konos. Principal photography wrapped in May 2012. Industrial Light and Magic returned to produce the visual effects for the film, assisted by Pixamondo and Atomic Fiction. The workload for the movie was enormous, with over 1,600 visual effects shots. The previous film had less than 1,000. The Enterprise was unchanged from its design in 2009, but this time new ships such as the USS Vengeance and the Klingon D-4 Scout Bird of Prey were also created in CG. While a practical set was built for the Volcano interior, almost all of this was replaced with an entirely digital environment. The Enterprise shuttle bay was also entirely digital. Composer Michael Giacchino also returned for Into Darkness. He carried over the same themes from his previous work, such as the main theme and Vulcan motifs. For Into Darkness, he created an original track for John Harrison, aka Khan, utilizing piano and heavy strings. For the Klingons, he created far more percussion-heavy tracks, layered with a men's choir chanting in Klingon. After a slow start in development, the much-anticipated sequel, Star Trek Into Darkness, was released on the 17th of April, 2013. It seems I open every other Star Trek movie retrospective with a line about this being a controversial entry in the franchise, and this is certainly true with Star Trek Into Darkness. Among the hardcore Trekkies, Into Darkness has bounced around people's rankings frequently, with some calling it the worst of the bunch, some naming it as their favourite, and others placing it somewhere in the middle. For me, Star Trek Into Darkness is a step down from the previous entry, but it's a film I still very much enjoy watching. Presentation-wise, everything I liked about the visual style and art direction of the 2009 Star Trek movie is back in Into Darkness. J.J. Abrams' slick but occasionally clumsy direction is back with just as much energy and grit as before, albeit with slightly less lens flare. Rather than repeating my previous thoughts on the visual style overall, I'll instead highlight the terrific art direction of this movie. I've said before that Into Darkness, in my opinion, has the best Klingon designs. That may be sacrilegious for some fans, but I absolutely love everything about this interpretation of the Klingons. Konos being a bombed-out, irradiated wasteland is a radically different creative choice, but I think it's well justified. The Aztec ruin-like structures of the planet suit the cultural aesthetic nicely. I love the armor and helmets making these Klingons appear almost demonic, like animated skeletons come to life to attack their enemy. I also love the design philosophy for the USS Vengeance as this dark reflection of the Enterprise. All sharp angles rather than elegant curves. It's all functional and minimalist as opposed to the bright gleaming Enterprise. It's really terrific work. Michael Giacchino produces yet another strong Star Trek score for Into Darkness. His original theme for John Harrison is hauntingly beautiful and dramatic. The action cues on Konos are especially great, propelling the fights and chases nicely, while also adding in texture with the Klingon chants. While Into Darkness may be even better looking and sounding than Star Trek 2009, I feel the script is much weaker. The inclusion of Khan is probably the most controversial aspect of the film for fans, and while it was a truly impossible task to follow the great Ricardo Montalban, I think Benedict Cumberbatch is fantastic in the role. However, his take on the character works largely because it's wisely not even attempting to copy what Montalban did with the character. Whereas Montalban's Khan was very theatrical, relishing each and every victory over his opponent, this version of Khan is in a much more desperate place, and Cumberbatch plays him with a lethal efficiency which can be truly scary. This Khan is always singularly focused on his objective, physically demolishing those who get in his way, and with Cumberbatch rattling off technobabble, exposition, and direct threats with a gravitas and speed which really convinces the audience of the character's great intellect as well as personal morality. Just like with previous Khan-centric stories, his character and the performance of the actor playing him overshadows the regular cast, who continue to be very strong. Pine and Quinto's Kirk and Spock are brilliant, with the two characters still developing the relationship we're familiar with, but in new and unexpected ways. Spock essentially betraying Kirk in the first act comes as a real shock. It shows us these characters are still learning how to be friends. But on the other hand, it's very gratifying to see Kirk's cavalier attitude to command get called out in this movie. I said before that in the previous movie, Kirk came across as too arrogant in a lot of scenes, and while his arrogance was tempered, it was never punished. But in Into Darkness, Kirk's assumption that he can think or fight his way out of anything is utterly destroyed, and Pine does a great job portraying that inner turmoil on screen. The other regular cast, just as before, don't get as rich character arcs, but they all get their moments to shine. Sulu taking command, Uhura staring down the Klingons, Scotty infiltrating the USS Vengeance, and so on. Newcomer Alice Eve also makes an impression as Carol Marcus, and Peter Weller has so much gravitas he can pull satellites out of orbit. In general, I would say the themes are also well explored from a narrative standpoint. It touches on similar ideas as Deep Space Nine's Homefront/Paradise Lost, fear of an outside threat leading to moral compromise. It all works well enough, and leaning into the War on Terror allegory makes revisiting these ideas very much relevant. What lets all of this down, though, is the messy plotting and ill-advised callbacks to older Star Trek entries. The twist of John Harrison actually being Khan is so obvious from the outset, and the delivery so nonsensical, it basically didn't need to be a twist at all. This version of Kirk has never met Khan before and likely has no idea who he is. This twist is only for the audience, and so it has no real impact on the story. If this character had simply been called Khan from the very beginning, it wouldn't really change anything. Repurposing elements from The Wrath of Khan also has very mixed results. Flipping the death scene so Kirk dies in the radiation chamber rather than Spock is clever to some degree, and the scene is very well acted. However, personally, all I can think while watching the scene is how it's a remix of The Wrath of Khan. Recognizing the overt reference to a previous Star Trek movie within this one stops me from getting caught up in the emotion. It distracts from the scene rather than enhances it. And while the plot contrivances in the previous film were forgivable for the most part, here there is some truly clumsy writing. While a lot of the internet nitpicking has exaggerated these flaws, the criticisms surrounding the portable transwarp beaming device and Khan's magic blood curing death are emblematic of bigger problems in the script. The Enterprise pursuing Khan to Konos is fine, but having him beam directly from Earth to the Klingon homeworld is pretty silly. Reverse engineering advanced medicine from Khan's genetically enhanced blood is also fine, but having Bones discover this right in the middle of the Vengeance blasting the shit out of the Enterprise feels incredibly forced. Ironclad plot logic is only one component of a successful movie, and oftentimes so-called plot holes can be overlooked, but Into Darkness is simply very messy and clunky, to the point where I can understand some viewers being taken out of the story altogether. For me though, the overall story does work, but I feel like the script needed another draft to iron out some of these kinks. And that's a sentiment which pretty much sums up my general feelings on the film. By no means is Star Trek Into Darkness a disaster or even outright bad. It's an enjoyable sci-fi action-adventure romp with some thrilling sequences, spectacular visual effects as well as solid character writing and compelling narrative themes. It's a fun movie to watch, but it does fall short of its predecessor. While Benedict Cumberbatch puts in an excellent performance, ultimately I think Khan's inclusion in the story and the mystery box marketing surrounding him was a mistake. It creates a lot of problems in the script, and the attempts to solve them muddy the waters with regards to the stronger elements in the film. I can totally see why some viewers felt repulsed or even angry at the movie, but personally I think a lot of Into Darkness's faults have been blown out of proportion over the years. Many would argue we should expect far more from a Star Trek movie than a turn your brain off action film, but to that I'd say Star Trek has been far worse than that. Star Trek Into Darkness is still pretty good, but it should have been great. Following the smash success of Star Trek 2009, Star Trek Into Darkness's reception was a bit more of a mixed bag. While it would go on to outgross the previous movie, reaching over $460 million worldwide, becoming the highest grossing Star Trek movie ever on a budget of $190 million, it's unclear if these box office numbers actually met studio expectations. Then again, studio expectations may have been enormously high. A lot of this is speculation on my part, but I believe Paramount Pictures wanted Star Trek Into Darkness to be their Dark Knight to Star Trek 09's Batman Begins. Remember at the time these movies came out, the model for blockbuster franchises was not an interconnected cinematic universe, but auteur-director-driven trilogies. We had Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, Michael Bay's Transformers, and Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight. Just like Batman Begins, Star Trek 09 was seen as a return to form for franchises which were previously seen to have devolved into irrelevancy or self-parody. Therefore, when Batman Begins, which did almost identical box office numbers to Star Trek, was followed by a darker sequel pitting its title character against his most well-known antagonist and went on to gross over $1 billion, it's easy to see why Paramount may have thought Into Darkness would perform just as well. Which is the reason why the whole mystery box secrecy surrounding Khan being in the film is such a misstep. It made the film worse and potentially prevented as much hype being generated for the sequel as was warranted. Reflecting on Into Darkness years later, J.J. Abrams said, "There are a number of characters we could have used and a number of issues that we talked about in terms of Khan, and one of them was, why do that? Why bring him back? We've established a brand new timeline, we could do anything we want. Let's just do something brand new." While ostensibly Star Trek Into Darkness was a success at the box office and with critics and wider audiences, the pop culture legacy of the film is difficult to parse. Among hardcore Trekkies, the movie is often derided in certain circles, but then again some do name it as one of, if not their outright favourite Star Trek movie. It's a mixed bag, not the triumphant follow-up to Star Trek's winning comeback many would have hoped it would be. Then again, if this era of Star Trek on the big screen was to be viewed as J.J. Abrams' Star Trek trilogy, then perhaps the next big screen outing could stick the landing. Thank you for watching. If you like these videos, subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay up to date on my new uploads. If you want to help the channel grow, join my patrons or my YouTube members, where you can see videos early as well as some other exclusive content. Speaking of which, I'd like to quickly thank all of my patrons and members who are now appearing on screen. Have a good one, and as always, live long and prosper.